Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and very good morning. I, Humar Rahman, welcome all the attendees from Pakistan and abroad at the first webinar organized by Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad, on a very vital topic, Dynamics of Nuclear South Asia, 22 Years of Deterrence. Thank you all for sparing time for this event. Before I invite Ambassador Ali Sarwar Naqvi for opening remarks and welcome remarks, I would like to introduce him. Ambassador Ali Sarwar Naqvi, in a long diplomatic career of 36 years, served at various diplomatic assignments, including the United Nations, both in New York and Washington, D.C., also in Vienna, London, Paris, and Brussels. After his retirement from Foreign Service, Ambassador Naqvi was appointed as member Chairman's Advisory Council in the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission and functioned as advisor to the Chairman PAEC on international affairs, with particular focus on IAEA matters. Ambassador Naqvi is the founding executive director of Islamabad-based think tank Center for International Strategic Studies, established in 2010. You have the mic, sir.
Thank you, Homa. It's indeed a very great pleasure. Dear participants, distinguished speakers, and worthy guests, I welcome you to this webinar on the dynamics of nuclear South Asia, 22 years of deterrence, organized by the Center for International Strategic Studies to commemorate the anniversary of our nuclear tests held on the 28th of May, 1998. In so doing, we are joining all other think tanks in Islamabad who have been marking the event since last week. I thank all who have joined us today for our webinar. Our webinar today will focus on 3 topics related to our nuclear capability acquired in May 1998. They are A, South Asian strategic environment pre and post 1998. B, Pakistan's acquisition of nuclear capability and the evolving threat spectrum in South Asia. And C, nuclear deterrence and crisis stability in South Asia. We are grateful to the 3 eminent speakers who have kindly agreed to speak on these topics. While they will be properly introduced by the host of the webinar, Ms. Humar Rahman, let me say a word or two about them. The first speaker will be our Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Naeem Salik, who is a recognized and a well-known expert on nuclear matters in general and South Asian nuclear affairs in particular. Our second speaker will be Dr. Mansoor Ahmed, also a senior fellow at CISS and a scholar and academic on the subject of nuclear arms and strategic stability. Last but not the least, in fact, a man of great ability and knowledge, the third speaker will be Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, a very highly regarded academic professor at Quaid-e-Azam University and a friend of CISS. Therefore, we hope to have a most enriching and edifying discussion of the subject by these worthy and highly qualified speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be listening to the learned discourses that will follow, I want to recall for you, on my part, the circumstances leading to the tests. As additional secretary at the Foreign Ministry at that time, I had a ringside seat in witnessing the evolving developments leading to the decision to do our tests. Events took a dramatic turn when India conducted 5 nuclear tests on May 11. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif at that time, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, was in Almaty, Kazakhstan on an official visit over there. Foreign Secretary Shamshad Ahmed was accompanying him. Now, this was the era of landline communications, of trunk calls based on wire links. Acting Foreign Secretary Anwar Kamal was caught up all afternoon and evening establishing communications with the Prime Minister and his party. We were told that the PM will return right away, and Foreign Secretary Shamshad Ahmed resumed charge the next day. Our immediate concerns were threefold. A, ascertain if the Indians intended doing more tests, and if so, when and where. B, check with our scientists and engineers through the chairman PAEC, Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, how soon we can undertake our tests. And C, monitor the international reaction, especially American, to the Indian tests. From May 11 onwards, every evening, we would assemble in the conference room of the old block in the Foreign Office, hold ongoing discussions, maintain contacts with our foreign missions, as well as the other ministries, especially the Ministry of Defense and the economic ministries, to discuss, assess, and analyze this situation. We asked friendly governments to check about Indian intention to do more nuclear tests. And we were told after a few days that their intelligence had not detected any such indication. Secondly, the PAEC and the other technical people conveyed to us that it would take them about 14 days to do our tests. The Prime Minister, having returned from Almaty, perhaps was in touch with them and gave them instructions to begin their preparations. Thirdly, our monitoring of the international reaction to the Indian tests indicated that it was not as angry or harsh as might have been expected. This meant that we need not worry too much on this score. The debate now was to weigh the pros and cons of holding our own tests. The negative impact of the test was quite clear. We would fall afoul of US non-proliferation legislation, under which we will be placed under immediate economic and defense-related sanctions. On the other hand, if we abstained from doing the tests, we would be able to gain economic benefits. This was the thrust of then US President Clinton to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in a number of phone calls made by the former to the latter. As regards the pro arguments, the first was widespread public sentiment to counter the Indian action by our own tests. This sentiment was further strengthened by Indian arrogance and bellicosity in public statements by BJP leaders like L.K. Advani and people like Sushma Swaraj at that time, who has apparently died recently. They all were part of the team of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the then Indian Prime Minister. So there was a widespread public sentiment, and further reinforced by the Indian pronouncements and declarations. Secondly, the economic inducements offered to us by the Americans, the Europeans, Japan, South Korea, etc., were not very substantive. Third, we received green signal from our technical people that the tests could be done, and they were prepared. The die was cast. the government gave the go-ahead to the PAC to prepare for conducting our nuclear tests in Shanghai, which happened on May 28. As they say, the rest is history. Two conclusions can be drawn from this account. One, the international reaction to the Indian nuclear test was not very strong and thus did nothing to check the imbalance that had occurred. Second, Pakistan's decision to conduct its nuclear tests was the result of careful considerations of all aspects of the situation and based on a very rigorous assessment of the pros and cons of testing. The ultimate conclusion was that it needed nuclear weapons capability for its security, and that was a consideration that overrode all the other considerations. With this background, it is quite also obvious that we became a nuclear power reluctantly. I will stop here and wish all the participants a worthwhile and fruitful session. I thought I'll just put this in to contribute to the discussion and set the tone for the speakers who come in their own order. Thank you very much. I pass on to our host, Ms. Huma Rahman.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Naqvi has set the tone for the webinar. Now, proceeding of the session, we have three speakers on our panel to discuss further the dynamics of nuclear South Asia. Before that, I would like to introduce each of our worthy panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Naeem Salik. Dr. Naeem Salik is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies. He has a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Western Australia. He has been a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center, Stanford University, Brookings Institution, and School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has served in the Pakistan Army, including Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at the Strategic Plans Division. He has published over 30 research articles. 2 books are in his credit too. Titled Genesis of South Asian Nuclear Deterrence was published by the Oxford University Press. His second book on Learning to Live with a Bomb, Pakistan 1998-2016, came out in 2017 and is a valuable addition to the subject. Our second panelist is Dr. Mansoor Ahmed. Dr. Mansoor Ahmed is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad. He is a former Stanton Junior Faculty Fellow and postdoctoral research fellow with the Managing the Atomic Project International Security Program at the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center. Previously, he was a research scholar at Cooperative Monitoring Center, Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque. He has also served as a lecturer in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Qaid-e-Azam University, and also served as a visiting faculty in the Department of Strategic and Nuclear Studies, National Defense University, Islamabad. Our third panelist is Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal. Dr. Jaspal is a professor at the School of Politics and International Relations, Qaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He holds PhD in International Relations. He did his advanced courses from European Peace University in Austria and also from Oslo University, Norway. Dr. Jaspal, as a guest speaker and visiting lecturer, had delivered and still continues to deliver lectures at many professional and training institutions, including Distinguished NATO School in Germany, NATO Defense College Rome, Italy, Center of Excellence Defense Against Terrorism, Ankara, Turkey. As introduced, we have extremely privileged experts on strategic affairs. So each panelist will speak for 15 minutes. All attendees are welcome to write their questions in Q&A and chat box. Over to you, Dr. Salik.
Thank you, Huma. I would not go into the details of the evolution of Pakistani and Indian nuclear programs, because I guess part of it would be covered by Dr. Mansoor, and maybe some portion of it by Dr. Jaspal. So I will confine myself to the strategic environment which provided the backdrop to the nuclear tests in 1998. At the end of the 1980s, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan had ended and the Soviet forces had withdrawn from Afghanistan in 1989, which had brought a change in the international security environment. And we saw that events happened one after the other in quick succession after that. The fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. That was a very important landmark because Soviet Union had been India's main strategic partner in international affairs for decades. And suddenly, that main pillar of India's external security support at international level was shaky and was not there for a while. So it was a chance for India to reappraise its policy and realign itself. And therefore, India very quickly decided to switch sides and go into the American camp and started developing strategic relations with the United States. We should also know that at the same time, in the early 1990s, there was this push for the non-proliferation efforts, especially the CTBT and Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. And this was in order to pacify the demands of non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT, because NPT had completed its original tenure of 25 years in 1995 and was due for extension. And to make sure the support of the non-nuclear weapon states, the nuclear weapon states at that time promised them that they will follow their commitments as per the NPT in letter and spirit. Not only they will start negotiations in good faith for the disarmament, but they will also start taking concrete measures in the form of bringing about a comprehensive test ban treaty and later on a fissile material cut-off treaty, for which the resolutions were introduced in the UN and passed in 1992. So in 1995, India realized that CTBT negotiations were at an advanced stage, and it would be only a matter of time before the CTBT comes into force, and that will close India's options for any conducting any nuclear tests. Therefore, India attempted to carry out another nuclear test in 1995, and that was during the regime of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. However, these Indian preparations for the test were picked up by the American satellites, and they put a lot of pressure on the Narasimha Rao government, and the test, which was supposed to be carried out in December 1995, had to be called off. Although the preparations on ground, like preparing the tunnels in the Pokhran Desert and other technical preparations, had already been carried out. Although the Americans were able to persuade India to postpone this test, but this during this pressurization and persuasion campaign, they shared the intelligence with the Indian side. We showed clearly that whatever indicators they had picked up of Indian preparations, that helped India to hide their preparations for tests in 1998. And they found out the gaps in the satellite coverage and also the indicators which were picked up by the American satellites, and they were camouflaged the next time around. In 1996, as we know, the CTBT was opened for signatures and India refused to sign it. Therefore, Pakistan, despite voting in affirmative, Pakistan also stayed out of it. And this was also the time in 1996 that in India, the BJP under Vajpayee got its first chance to form a government at the federal level in India. Uh, and as soon as Vajpayee was given the nod by the Indian president to start efforts to form his government, he immediately ordered the Indian scientists to prepare for nuclear tests. And the preparations were started once again. However, this government was very short-lived. It only survived for 15 days. And because Vajpayee failed to get the vote of confidence from the Indian Parliament, then these preparations had to be called off. In 1998, there were another general election held in India. And in February 1998, during that election campaign, BJP issued its election manifesto, which, besides other points, very clearly stated that if they come to power, they will review India's nuclear policy and exercise the nuclear weapons option. Most of the people took it as an election rhetoric and thought that if the BJP succeeds in coming to power, they may not follow through with that commitment. Uh, then in April 1998, the BJP finally came into the power in New Delhi. And as soon as the Vajpayee government had taken power, he again ordered the Indian scientists to prepare for the nuclear tests. While the Americans and the other outside powers were waiting for the review of India's strategic environment by the newly formed National Security Council, the Indians were already well on the way to prepare for the nuclear tests. In April 1998, Pakistani Prime Minister also wrote letters to the major world powers, uh, warning them that Pakistan has intelligence to suggest that India is preparing to conduct nuclear tests. But unfortunately, that warning fell on deaf ears and no notice was taken of that. And then we see that on 11th of May 1998, India conducted 3 nuclear tests, and one of which was claimed to be a thermonuclear test. And obviously, after that, the Indian attitude immediately changed, it became very belligerent, and people like Vajpayee and Madan Lal Khurana and other BJP leaders, they were openly threatening Pakistan and telling Pakistan to roll back its policy about Kashmir and to realize the changed strategic environment. Now, this kind of belligerent propaganda had 2 purposes. One, to egg on Pakistan to respond to India's tests so that the pressure which India was facing, whatever little pressure they were facing, could be further dissipated by shifting of the attention towards Pakistan. And secondly, if Pakistan failed to respond to these tests, then they will have a psychological and strategic ascendancy over Pakistan, and they'll be able to browbeat Pakistan and make it follow India's dictates. However, as mentioned by Mansoor Ahmed Naqvi also, after due considerations of the pros and cons, Pakistan decided that there was no option now left for it than to respond to the Indian nuclear test to restore the strategic balance in South Asia, which had been very badly disturbed. And therefore, Pakistan conducted its first set of nuclear tests, 5 nuclear tests on 28th of May, and another test on 30th of May. In 1999, uh, India realized that now Pakistan is also nuclear power, and a kind of strategic parity has been achieved in South Asia. And therefore, they have to come around to settle things with Pakistan and create some kind of a structure in South Asia to restrain a nuclear arms race, as well as to uh, create a kind of strategic stability. Uh, After that visit in February 99, there was a long list of about 7 or 8 CBMs which were agreed upon in the Lahore MOU between the two sides. But soon after that, in May 99, it came into open that the conflict had started in the Kargil area, and that upset this process. The Kargil conflict also brought in the US intervention into stopping this conflict at an early stage. There was a lot of pressure on Pakistan from the international community as well, because people were fearful that in a nuclear environment, if this conflict expands, it might turn into a nuclear exchange between the two new nuclear powers. However, the fact of the matter is that this was too early after the nuclearization, and neither India nor Pakistan had a fully operational nuclear capability at that time. Anyhow, this fear of nuclear escalation was still there, but Pakistan found that the strategic environment had changed to its disadvantage, particularly the way the Americans intervened on India's side, and they forced Pakistan to accept the terms of ceasefire agreement, which were totally lopsided and in favor of India. In 2000, already uh, Americans had started the process in the Congress to start lifting the nuclear test-related sanctions against India, uh, and against Pakistan. There was no such move in favor of Pakistan, because after the military coup in October '99, there were in fact another layer of sanctions on Pakistan, which were so-called democracy-related sanctions. But India was already starting to get the reprieve. And then in 2001, the 9/11 happens, and the situation once again changed drastically, not only in the region but internationally, and the new war on terror started, in which the Americans needed Pakistan's support. So therefore, they also decided to lift the layers of sanctions against Pakistan, and the process of nuclear-related sanctions, lifting of nuclear-related sanctions against India and Pakistan was initiated. In 2001, as a result of the attack on Indian Parliament in December 2001, Indians started mobilizing their forces along borders with Pakistan, and there was a 10-month military standoff between India and Pakistan, in which almost 1 million troops were eyeball to eyeball, and there was a danger of escalation. However, at the same time, the Americans were involved in an operation in Afghanistan, and they could not afford a war starting between India and Pakistan at their back, and they did not want their lines of communication which were passing through Pakistan to be disturbed. Therefore, they carried out a lot of diplomatic activity. A lot of senior American officials were frequently visiting Islamabad and New Delhi to bring the situation to some resolution. The British and other major world powers also played their role. And finally, the standoff was ended in October 2002. Later on, we had other crises also, especially the 2008 Mumbai crisis, which was again resolved with the American intervention. But the Indians did not threaten to mobilize their forces again. They had already introduced the Cold Start war doctrine in 2004, and had been rehearsing it through core size and bigger war games. They had carried out, in fact, 7 war games by 2008. However, in 2008 Mumbai crisis, they did not even mention Cold Start even once, and they were talking about surgical strikes to take revenge of the Mumbai attack. Then the situation changed in 2014 once the Modi government took power in India, and it adopted a very aggressive and belligerent policy towards Pakistan, not only at the rhetorical level but also practically and physically on ground by upping the ante along the line of control, by increasing the scope and intensity of aggression at line of control, not only in terms of the frequency of ceasefire violation, but also the kind of weapons which were now being used in those kind of across the line of control firing incidents. In 2016, there was an incident of an attack by the Kashmiri Mujahideen on Indian cantonment of Uri in the Indian occupied Kashmir, which resulted in the killing of a dozen or so Indian soldiers. And the Indian government announced that we will take revenge of that. Later on in September 2016, Indians claimed to have carried out a surgical strike across the line of control, wherein at three places, small forces of Indian military, they infiltrated through the gaps in the line of control and claimed to have carried out certain actions against the so-called terrorist launch pads in Pakistani occupied area of Kashmir. However, Pakistan declared that there was no such incident which happened on our side, and there was no evidence provided by India to confirm that this kind of an operation were actually carried out. However, the most disturbing aspect of this incident was that the international community, instead of advising India not to go down this dangerous path, they sort of patted India on the back and said that India was probably justified in taking this kind of action, and they would approve of it if India does it again. And they, in fact, they were reconciled to the idea that in future, whenever there is a terrorist incident on the Indian side, India would be carrying out this kind of a reprisal action against Pakistan. Then in 2019, while India was in the midst of an election campaign, an incident happened in Pulwama in the Indian occupied Kashmir, wherein a convoy of India's Central Reserve Police Force was attacked by a local teenager who blew himself up with a explosive filled car, and was able to kill about 40 plus Indian CRPF personnel. This was immediately followed by an announcement by Mr. Vajpayee that we will take revenge of this incident. And he said that I have given authorization to the Indian Armed Forces to get ready to and to decide on when and how they will take revenge of this. So it was expected that Indians will take an action because they wanted to take advantage of this incident in terms of taking advantage of winning votes. And it has been the vote winning formula for Vajpayee to raise the tensions with Pakistan. They have done it time and again, and they wanted to use it once again. As a result, about 2 weeks after the Pulwama incident, the Indians breached the line of control, this time not on the ground but in the air. Their aircraft came a few knots, nautical miles inside the Pakistani airspace and launched standoff weapons of 60-kilometer range at a target near Balakot in Pakistan, which supposedly was a terrorist training camp. And the Indians immediately claimed that we have destroyed that so-called camp, and we have killed over 300 so-called terrorists. But the situation on ground, which was shown to the international observers also later on, was that there was no damage on the ground. The Indians had missed their target, and there were no casualties. I think this was a good fortune that there was no casualties, because if the kind of casualties which Indians were claiming had happened, the consequences would have been far more serious. Pakistan had made it clear before this Indian action that should India take any military action against Pakistan, Pakistan would respond with equal force, and there is no question that Pakistan will stay back this time. And as it happened, the very next day, Pakistan Air Force undertook an operation across the line of control and carried out uh, an attack on Indian targets, deliberately delivering their weapons some distance away from the actual targets to avoid casualties, just to send a message to India that their aggression would not go unmatched, and Pakistan would respond in equal terms. Once the Pakistani aircraft were returning back to their airspace, some Indian aircraft tried to chase Pakistani aircraft, and in that resulting air exchange, uh, two Indian aircraft were hit. One probably fell on the Indian side. The other, MiG-21, along with its pilot, Wing Commander Abhinandan, fell on the Pakistani side. The pilot was captured and later on released by Pakistan. So this changed the situation altogether. Again, this time we found that before the Indian action, very senior American officials like Secretary of State Mr. Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton had virtually given green signal to India to go ahead with their aggressive designs, and showed them the support. And once India conducted that action, the immediate response was again of kind of a glee and celebration, and patting India on the back, and encouraging them for having done what they had done. But soon after Pakistan's response, the situation changed, and then immediately there were calls of restraint and to de-escalate the situation, which was duly de-escalated later on, because India did not want to face further embarrassment with elections just around the corner. The Indians were claiming that they are going to set a new normal. Yes, in a way, the new normal was set, and in a way, it was not set. It was not set in terms of Indian perception of a new normal, but a new normal was set from the perspective of Pakistan, that in future, if in response to any terrorist incident on the Indian soil, India tries to aggress against Pakistan, Pakistan will respond to it very strongly. And Pakistan has since declared its policy of quid pro quo plus, which means that whatever India does, Pakistan will respond in equal measure, plus something of its own. The 2019 incident between India and Pakistan has a very serious destabilizing effect, because this has set a pattern where we found that India's Prime Minister, who has his finger on the nuclear button and is the final authority to launch India's nuclear weapons, he made some very irresponsible statements. In one of those, he said that we have not kept our nuclear weapons to be used on Diwali, which is an Indian Hindu celebration and event where they use firecrackers and fireworks. And then, and in another statement, he said that if our pilot had not been released, we are going to launch what they call Qatal Giraz, which means night of slaughter. And later on, some news suggested, although there has been no public confirmation of that, that Indians were preparing for a missile strike against 5 or 6 Pakistani cities. Pakistan had made it very clear that had India undertaken that missile strike, Pakistan would have responded with a much greater response, probably 3 times what Indians would have launched. So this is where the situation stands. The stability, strategic stability in South Asia rests on a very shaky ground. It is tenuous. It is very unstable, and unfortunately, in the absence of an overarching strategic sustained regime or any institutionalized arrangements, this situation will remain very dangerous. And I end my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for recapping all major events which affected South Asian strategic environment. Now, taking lead from the factors highlighted by Dr. Salik, now Dr. Mansoor will shed light on strategic trends and trajectories which are affecting uh, the core dynamics of strategic stability in South Asia. Over to you, Dr. Mansoor.
Thank you very much. I'll just give a brief rundown of what Pakistan has achieved in the nuclear field since it started the program in 1972. As you're all aware that Pakistan launched its weapons program immediately in the aftermath of the separation of East Pakistan in the first half of 1972. The initial policy was to acquire the necessary know-how, build the necessary infrastructure through international cooperation, especially fuel cycle facilities, to acquire the nuclear option, basically. Because half of the trained manpower that had been trained in the 1960s had left for Bangladesh. And the total manpower available at the beginning of 1972 was 283. This is scientists, engineers, and technicians in the Atomic Energy Commission. And Pakistan had no fuel cycle infrastructure. The first power reactor, the Karachi nuclear power plant, was still in the final stages of construction, and PINSTEC had not yet been fully operationalized. The Pakistani political and technical leadership was fully aware of India's work on peaceful nuclear explosives, which they had openly been talking about in the 4th Geneva Conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy in 1971. So then came in India's nuclear test, surprise nuclear test in 1974, May 1974, which they dubbed the Smiling Buddha, and called it a peaceful nuclear explosion, when in fact it was the test of an actual nuclear device. The immediate result of that was that while India had committed the original sin, Pakistan now had to pay the price. And the agreements that Pakistan had signed for several fuel cycle facilities under the safeguards of the IAEA were all cancelled unilaterally. And Pakistan was expected to either sign the NPT or open up its nuclear program for international inspections if it wanted to continue with those agreements. That was an unacceptable proposition for Pakistan, and therefore it was decided to launch an indigenous fuel cycle program in earnest right after India's nuclear test, in addition to work on the weapons program. And between 1975 and the early 80s, Pakistan completed more than 7 nuclear plants and facilities in the nuclear fuel cycle, which of course, and there were 2 teams that were working basically. One was the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, which was responsible for all fuel cycle activities, all civilian uses of atomic energy, weaponization, nuclear testing, and plutonium production and reprocessing. Whereas one project, which was separate, the Khan Labs, was responsible for the centrifuge enrichment program. And in 1983, Pakistan conducted the first, in March 83, the first cold test of a working nuclear device. That was an indigenous design. And from that point on until the mid-90s, there were about 24 more cold tests, while Pakistan continued to develop the capacity for fissile material production because it had mastered the complete nuclear fuel cycle. And that is why it was able to respond so quickly to India's nuclear tests in 1998. However, the opportunity cost was Pakistan's peaceful nuclear program, because Pakistan relied on international cooperation. There was a virtual embargo on nuclear energy cooperation until 1986, when China and Pakistan signed a comprehensive civil nuclear agreement. under which separate contracts would later be finalized for the supply of nuclear power plants under the IAEA safeguards in the form of Chashma 1, 2, 3, and 4, and now 2 more power reactors are under construction in Karachi. So looking forward, in the past 2 decades of nuclearization, Pakistan operationalized its nuclear deterrent, as did India. And both countries seem to be locked in competition which is akin to the Cold War style competition between the superpowers in many ways, but with different characteristics. So how does the outlook, what is the outlook for the future basically? The trends and trajectories suggest that a new revolution in military affairs is taking place in South Asia. This is similar to what happened in the 1980s between NATO and Warsaw Pact, with the acquisition of new types of conventional technologies and strategic capabilities built up. And the difference now in South Asia is that it is generating instabilities because of the asymmetries and imbalances in the capabilities of India and Pakistan, basically. So we see the manifestation of this. I personally think that in South Asia is a classic case where technological innovation and maturation and development is driving doctrinal change, which is providing a cover for policy changes happening in India, basically. The first, of course, is you've seen with the surfacing of the India's joint doctrine in 2017 and in their land warfare doctrine. This is the first time that they have actually articulated the kind of force structure and build up both on the conventional and the nuclear side that they are broadly looking at. I mean, it provides the broad framework. And the debate on India's nuclear first use, whether it requires changes or not, is no coincidence. It's also a subset of the change that has occurred because of the changes in technological field in military technology and RMA that is going on over there. So in India's land warfare doctrine, it is clearly stated that India plans for a two-front war. While it seeks to deter China, but strive for escalation dominance in full spectrum of operations against Pakistan. This is very interesting, and the ongoing confrontation in Ladakh along the line of actual control is a manifestation of exactly this kind of a military thinking in India. And very interestingly, India's Defense Minister Rajnath Singh only yesterday in an interview was talking of peaceful overtures to resolve the ongoing dispute with China, but he restated his claim that India should and would take control of Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. So this itself is a manifestation of what was of the thinking that was there in India's land warfare doctrine and how they are looking at building their capabilities. So it's important to look at the trends of the defense spending, because that will essentially determine where the capability gap might be heading in the next decade or 2 decades. India and Pakistan have about, Pakistan's GDP is about less than $300 billion and India is around $3 trillion. The current COVID related recession is likely to dampen and reduce their GDP growth rate substantially, but eventually they will be able to recover. And there is no sign that they are going to cut down their military modernization. There might be some kind of reduction in defense spending temporarily, and that will be substituted through indigenization. And the one advantage that India has is that it has access to technology transfers and collaborative projects, especially with the United States. Secondly, in terms of conventional forces, I think the biggest imbalance that exists right now, which is still growing and is likely to grow, which will have long-term implications for regional stability, is in the naval domain. Um, I, in this decade, India is poised to add three more S-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, each of which will be able to carry 16 ICBM range submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which would be armed with 4 to 5 multiple warheads. They're already adding 2 more Arihant class submarines and 6 nuclear attack submarines. They have sanctioned funds for 6 AIP equipped conventional attack stealth submarines and expanding their naval surface fleet. More importantly is anti-submarine warfare. They are currently operating the largest fleet of P-8I Neptune ASW aircraft outside the United States. And they've just finalized an order for 24 MH-24 Romeo ASW helicopters. Then they will be having access to Israeli and American technology in lasers, in electronic warfare, and in net-centric operations, etc. But much of their deployments, the conventional force deployments, are essentially poised against Pakistan, even though they've begun shifting some troops against China. But the offensive strike corps of the army, most of their air bases are deployed against Pakistan. And they are now also reorganizing the Eastern and Western naval commands so that they can act jointly either against Pakistan or in terms of burden sharing in the Indo-Pacific against China, along with the United States. But any capability that India adds in terms of its conventional or strategic domain can potentially be used and deployed against Pakistan. And the current trend suggests that India essentially lacks the will and the ability to confront China militarily, while it has used the China card to acquire high-tech weapon systems and all kinds of strategic concessions from the United States. While it will continue to its conventional force modernization that will primarily be aimed at achieving escalation dominance against Pakistan, it will seek to deter China through strategic force buildup, which again is usable against Pakistan also. And here, as I've mentioned several times before, is one critical aspect that is fueling their strategic triads buildup, that is the fissile material capabilities. And currently, they have about 900 kilograms of weapon-grade plutonium, 4.4 tons of highly enriched uranium, about 35%, up to 35% enrichment, and 7 to 10 tons of civil plutonium outside safeguards, which has been separated and is available for weapon use. Now, they've been accumulating the civil plutonium for their breeder program. The breeder program has been delayed for the 8th time again. And all of that will potentially be available for the weapons program because they're increasing their reprocessing capacity. And the reactor-grade plutonium, which is also civil plutonium, produced in their indigenous heavy water power reactors, is more suitable for warheads up to 20 kiloton, which can be used for counterforce strikes. And here comes in India's counterforce capabilities. They're already integrating dual-use missiles to their air, land, and sea platforms. Under the SFC, the Strategic Forces Command, that means that the BrahMos and the Nirbhais, some of those missile systems will be available for nuclear first strikes, and others can be used for conventional counterforce strikes against command and control, which can produce strategic consequences during a crisis with Pakistan. So a two-front war, essentially, in my view, is only a paper tiger. India, at the moment, does not have the capacity for two-front conflict. It doesn't even have a decisive conventional military advantage against Pakistan. Therefore, it is now talking of changing its no first use policy and also retaining the nuclear option for use against Pakistan and possibly for deterring China also. And most of their missiles, the triad of the cruise missiles and the ballistic missiles, some of whom are being canisterized for first strikes have ranges that are Pakistan specific. Very few of those, they're still working on their Agni 5 and Agni 6 that can be termed as purely China specific long range systems. And even the missiles on their Arihant at the moment does not have the range to reach China, even though it is a second strike platform. So the imbalance in modernization and technology innovation and influx and defense spending can produce unintended effects for crisis and deterrent stability. So what is the way forward for Pakistan? Pakistan will have to avoid into getting into a tit for tat arms race and maintain the credibility of its full spectrum deterrence posture, while also developing conventional deterrence capabilities, which is part of the full spectrum posture essentially. And the most important thing is to invest in R&D, build indigenous capabilities through collaborative projects, and also to focus on the economy, because essentially it's a competition between national power. And for Pakistan to sustain a credible deterrent posture, nuclear weapons on their own will only be effective if it is backed by solid national power and economic potential. And that will require structural reforms, governance reforms, and bureaucratic reforms, especially in the way the policies are made and implemented. The Office of the Auditor General, for example, needs to be strengthened. There has to be accountability at the grassroots level, and private sector enterprises have to be strengthened, and those public sector enterprises that are going that are incurring heavy losses, for which the government has to give them a lot of subsidies, they will need to be privatized at some point. And all of that needs a holistic economic reform package. That is what India did in the 90s. That is what China started doing in the 80s. And unless that happens, the economic stagnation that is plaguing the country for so many years will continue. And that will directly impinge upon national security. I think this is the most important Achilles heel in Pakistan's national power and Pakistan's ability to maintain a credible defense posture, that it needs to invest and sustain a high level of economic growth, especially in terms of the population growth that is taking place in South Asia. And in the final analysis, I would say that the problem now is that defense spending as a percentage of GDP, I mean, in India's case, they have a much larger GDP. In Pakistan, is a much smaller GDP. But the Indians will, because of such a large GDP, will be able to take their defense budget from 70 billion right now to about a projected 300 billion in the next 20 years. Pakistan has about 10 to 11 billion defense spending, and unless the economic space is really increased, Pakistan will not be able to sustain the level of the minimum level of credible deterrence that is required for military modernization and for the economic well-being of the people, etc. And that is itself will act as a deterrent against irrational decision makers in New Delhi. I personally think that it doesn't really matter if there is a Congress government in India or there is a BJP government in India, only their style is different. They have a self-image of a rising power, and that is being fueled and propped up by the United States. And you will see an increase in this trend in the foreseeable future. And the only way that Pakistan can balance it is through partnerships with other countries and while maintaining good relations with the United States as well. But the key is to maintain and to develop indigenous capabilities like the Turks, for example. Turkey is a classic example that has built up its defense industry. Israel has built up its defense industry. And that will also have spin-off effects for economic growth and development. Thank you.
Homa, can you unmute your?
Thank you, Dr. Mansoor. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Mansoor. So now I would like to invite Jaspal to highlight and take the lead from what Dr. Mansoor and Sir Salik had just said. So please, sir, kindly elaborate on the crisis stability and the future trajectories of strategic stability in South Asia. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Ambassador Naqvi and his team for providing me this opportunity to present my views on this very important topic, nuclear deterrence and crisis stability in South Asia. Let me start theoretically speaking that when we talk about nuclear deterrence and crisis stability in South Asia, we assume that there is a mutual assured destruction capability on both sides, and both states are acting rationally. It realizes that both states realizes that there is a probability of an inherent risk of unpredictable escalation, and which is not in the interest of neither Pakistan nor India. So conventional war or all-out conventional war leading towards the escalation of nuclear war is not accepted. It's an established fact. If we recall what the Dr. Salik Saab and the Dr. Mansoor have rightly pointed out in a comparative study, both states lack the full first strike capability, and that's why they cannot decapitate and tally each other's striking capability. So if we can limit ourselves with this perception, there must be deterrence stability, or what we call it crisis stability. But there is a problem. The problem here is that we cannot translate it into a strategic stability, because there is one element when we look about the strategic stability that is missing. That is an arms race stability. Mansoor very rightly pointed out the trend in South Asia is modernization of warfighting capability, whether nuclear or conventional. So it means that there's no arms race stability. And then that means the half part or half portion, which on the basis of which one can say there is a strategic stability, is missing in South Asia. Now, the second point is that, as I can take a lead from my both, you can say, colleagues, that if you focus or precisely see India's nuclear posture objective, India's nuclear posture objective is to deter China and to compel Pakistan. So that is the way how we try to interpret, and I can link here what the Salik Saab has pointed out earlier, that after the Pulwama crisis, the rhetoric which we have heard from the Indian side, especially the statements were made by the Prime Minister Modi, they generate this impression, or if we decode, that gives us an impression that India has adopted a nuclear compellence strategy against a nuclear armed state. They were talking about Pakistan's nuclear bluff, but the question here is, which I leave for the audience, is the China called the India's nuclear bluff in the last 1 month? So having said this, that leads us to what the theoretically or in the literature has been established, that if an uncontrolled war would lead to a mutual destruction, in the nuclear powers, there's no war. But this very stability allows either side to use limited violence because the other's threat to respond by all-out retaliation cannot be very credible. So in that kind of a context, or in this side of a strategic environment, and then if we can focus about the past 2 decades development, starting from Kargil, standoff 2001, 2002, 2000 in Mumbai, or Pulwama last year, we find that there is a space for limited or conventional war. India has tried to create it. However, Pakistan has tried to bridge that gap. So that leads me to this sort of situation where we say, theoretically speaking, there must be a deterrence stability. Both states should work for the crisis stability. But practically, situation, let's say, if I can just say in 3rd June 2020, maybe I sound pessimistic, but the crisis stability is not there. There are factors I have identified, or I can roughly point it out, 9 factors which damage or undermine the crisis stability between India and Pakistan. My first point here is that India's almost nearly 2 decades, or you can say since 2005, struggle starting with the concept of create space for limited war through cold start doctrine, and what we can say by creating an option for kinetic military actions. In the beginning, it used to say punitive action, then we heard hot pursuit, and now surgical strike. And I think the surgical strike has been documented in India's armed forces doctrine in April 2017. So one cannot underestimate, as the Western scholars used to say, that there was no cold start doctrine in the case of India, who are very much pro-India, or they were not ready to buy, but at least now they cannot deny surgical strike because it's part of their armed forces, joint armed forces doctrine. And if you read their 2018 land warfare doctrine, it is also referenced there. So my understanding is that this kind of a thinking in a nuclear armed state, against a nuclear armed state, that is also creates the situation for crisis instability. Second is that we can here not underestimate Pakistan's resilience to support Indian, you can say Kashmiri's right of self-determination. So Pakistan has been continuously supporting despite all these crises, and even today, and it is unwilling or unprepared to accept India's hegemony in South Asia. Pakistan has been maintaining a war-fighting capability to check the Indian aggression, and it is very much explained by the Dr. Mansoor when he was giving us a comparative study, and at the same time, what the Salik has already pointed out, that Pakistan's strategy is very clear, that what we quid pro quo plus. So this plus means that Pakistan is very much determined. Whatever when I was reviewing the Pakistan's nuclear posture in the Western literature, a few scholars have written, one cannot fix them in their branding, whether it's an escalatory, whether it's a catalyst, or whether it's a retaliatory. It's a mixture of sort of things. But anyway, that is very much clear. So Pakistan has invented its own nuclear posture, you can say. So that's why in case of India, the same thing you find it. The third is, or I can say the vocabulary to analyze, which is available from the Cold War, it is not giving us a much, you can say, guidance in this case. So we have to rethink in abstract within this context. My third point is this, the imbalance. The imbalance in conventional military capabilities, and in the during the last 2 decades, this imbalance has created instability paradox. But at the same time, it buttressed what we call its offensive defense imbalance. And theoretically speaking, offensive defense imbalance, the power which is in advantage state or having a offensive capability, it always go for preemptive strikes, or what they call it, to justify legally preventive war. So that is also there. And when we heard about these kind of the surgical strikes or punitive action, it qualifies that on which side or on which issues India has been working. The fifth point in this context is it is overall global strategic environment. And if you see in the global strategic environment, India has been encouraged to, you can say, acquire a capacity to implement its new normal, or what India says, Indian Ocean is India's ocean, or what you can here, I can just refer coupling Indo-Pacific strategy of the Delhi and Indo-Pacific strategy emanating from what you call it for Washington. So in that context, if the West is viewing, or the American-led in the new emerging Cold War kind of situation, if they are thinking India will be able to balance China, whether India will be going to check China or not, whether India has a capacity for it, or whether India has a policy for it, it's a different debate. But one thing is established, that with this buildup of India or a modernization of India, it will be further, you can say, enhancing the imbalance of power between India and Pakistan, and which is also encourages such kind of a crisis instability. So my sixth point was linked with this Indian Ocean. I had already identified. The sixth is, if we can go now here, whether we can, you can say, review the literature with reference to the causes of the war, and we try this famous theory in the international level, for 3 levels of analysis. And if I can apply this individual level of analysis in the case of India, If you focus on India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi Sahib and his associates, how you define them, a follower of Hindutva mindset, hyper-nationalist, okay, that can be a terms which cannot be used. If I can go with more practical or realistic way of thinking, what were their slogans during the election campaign, how the Indian public reflected. So in that context, the domestic situation in India is such as that these leaders have failed to deliver in the last 6 years economically. So they are looking with a concept of hyper-nationalism to us and they, and divert the internal crisis maybe on the external side, and that is also not good for a crisis stability or for a deterrent stability. Then it leads to what we can say, if we can critically examine India's quest for escalation dominance, and my final point in this context is absence of an arms control. So if I can here go to my third part, what is happening in the South Asian context, I'm very clear in this case that when we focus on the South Asian context, I can, based on my first 2 points, theoretically, yes, we feel convinced that there is a probability of deterrent stability. But for a deterrent stability, you need an arms control arrangement. You need you can say, absence of preventive or preemptive postures of the strategic competitors, which both are missing in the case of South Asia. So when we talk about deterrent stability, that is not qualified. Now, when we talk about the, what we call it, crisis stability, crisis has been going on. Yes, it's correct. The line of control crisis since decades is there. And in the last, you can say, 2 decades, both India and Pakistan, I can say, managed to not permit the escalation of this crisis. Even if you can see 26th, 27th February, this air combat, which was uncalculated. I think both sides were not desiring at that time. It was a miscalculation. But as we know, if there's a crisis, crisis can escalate. You can anticipate these kind of the things. So that gives us an impression that the probability of crisis escalation is there, as I already listed a few reasons. Now, how I can conclude this current situation? Let me first, the technological modernization has been taking place. Pakistan has been working different, you can say, striking capabilities, adding the MIRVs. India has been working, in addition to that, India has been purchasing what you call it S-400 defensive systems. India has been purchasing or building its BMD systems. So it's a very, you can say, kind of an arms race. But at the same time, what's happening at the global level? If you focus on the nuclear posture of the United States, Russians, Chinese, and what are the trends? The trend is nuclear arms modernization. If you can go with the application of the chain reaction, then there must be nuclear arms, you can say, modernization in South Asia. Even though the trends in the South Asia are very much conducive and supportive to the nuclear arms race in South Asia, but again, the international trends are very much supportive. Recently, what happened? That the President Trump gave the impression of leaving the CTBT. Yes, they are only signatory of the draft of the CTBT, but maybe they are member of the Geneva Convention on the Arms Control, on the 1969 Geneva Convention on the laws of the treaties. So even being a signatory, they have to announce that they are leaving it. Think hypothetically, if they can go for, you can say, leaving the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, definitely they go for testing. So if they start testing, with the keeping in mind this new technological invasion, and especially when the states are working on this super, what we call it, hyper kind of a delivery vehicles. So definitely they need a new modeling of the nuclear devices. And in this new era, new modeling, new testing, new kind of the developments, it will be definitely leading us to the South Asia. My understanding is earlier in the 1998, after the 1998, Indians maintained that they had a thermonuclear test successful, but later on from 2010, their own scientists started claiming it fizzled out. So definitely in this current situation, to divert the attention, whether India need a new testing or not, to divert the attention of the domestic, you can say, population, towards the other side, like Indira Gandhi did in 1974. So they may go for a testing if the Americans start. So that is the point, that testing of nuclear devices is itself a qualification that they are going for technological innovation and revolution. So that leading to the revolution. Second is absence of arms control, absence of even dialogue process. And that's why Prime Minister of Pakistan has been alarming continuously false flag operation probability. So it means that if this is if Pakistanis are thinking that there is a probability of false flag operation, definitely there is a high alert. And if there is a high alert on this side, on the other side is already there. So what is the situation? That situation indicates that there is no crisis stability. There is a more, we are towards the crisis instability. The third, from the false flag, if you see, what is the part of, or you can say, situation is happening. On the one side, and here I can again take what the Mansoor has very rightly pointed out about the Indian minister yesterday, what he was saying, that they are ready to resolve or settle the border dispute with the China peacefully, but they are threatening Pakistan, and that leads or qualify my point that India has a nuclear compelled strategy. And all the, you can say, nuclear experts believe, if you review the literature, they say nuclear compelled strategy is not workable against the nuclear armed state. So this is a confusion. And that confusion also creates this environment which is very much prone to crisis instability. So my here final comment, or I will leave here by saying, though theoretically, after the nuclearization in the 2 decades, one can expect that India and Pakistan, after the 4 major crises, have been matured enough to go for and to live with the deterrent stability and work, you can say, collectively or bilaterally for addressing the ingredients of crisis and stability, so that we should be having a crisis stability. But unfortunately, despite one actor, I can say here, Pakistan's desire for going or avoiding the crisis instability and establishing the crisis stability like nuclear restraint regime or other kinds of the proposal, the other side is unwilling because its agenda is broader. It thinks that it is a great power. Its allies thinks that it is a great power. Its allies thinks that it must grow militarily. It must grow by capabilities to check another rising power. And who is the victim? The victim is Pakistan, and Pakistan is again determined to balance, to check the Indians' aggression, what we call it, as I can again repeat it, Pakistan's current strategy, what we call it, quid pro quo plus. So it means that Pakistan is not only willing to simply retaliate, its retaliation is going to further ahead. So that is a situation with which we have to live, and we are living. And in the near future, I think the situation will not change. Thank you very much.
I thank all the panelists for giving wonderful, wonderful presentations and remarks. So now we are moving towards the question answer sessions to further elaborate the discussion and few points. We have few questions, some are coming in because this session was going live on Facebook and YouTube. We have social media questions as well, but I will ask first to all the panelists from the questions asked in the webinar. So few questions are more or less same, but I will merge two, but I will identify the question from where it is coming from. So first question we have from Air Marshal Ishfaq, Director CAS, to all the panelists. It is related to the US new announcements for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The question is that from various official statements, US seem to set to start nuclear tests. If US exits CTBT, the treaty is likely to fall apart. In such an eventuality, is India likely to carry out nuclear tests to make up for the failed test in the 1998 and accumulate more data on their technological improvements? And if India conducts nuclear tests, should Pakistan follow suit? And what would be the likely repercussions for both the countries, again, in the light of 1998 nuclear testing by both India and Pakistan? And the link-up question by Dr. Zafar Ali is that also if the speakers could highlight implications of restart of nuclear testing on NPT RevCon and strategic environment in South Asia. So the question is for all the panelists, whosoever wish to answer first. Please, sir. I guess, Sir Salik, you can start.
Okay. First of all, I think we have to be clear that US is a signatory to the CTBT. It has not ratified it. So it's not a state party to the CTBT as yet. Secondly, CTBT has not entered into force. So talking of unraveling of CTBT is something which is not really accurate because it has not come into force. So what to talk of unraveling? The next aspect is that it is only the international norm against testing which has been established as a result of CTBT negotiations and signatures by some countries, including some of the P5, that a norm has been set. But if the US decides to go against this norm and start testing, that will open the floodgates, and that would, I think, India would be very happy to hear that news of US starting and conducting another nuclear test, because they have been very worried about the failure of their thermonuclear test, and they would be looking for an opportunity to at least test and confirm the design of the thermonuclear devices, which will mean that it will open a Pandora's box, and for Pakistan to respond or not, that will be a difficult decision. However, we have to see that the situation is now different from 1998. In 1998, we had to test because we had to reestablish the strategic stability and demonstrate our nuclear capability. Now we do not have that kind of compulsion that we have to demonstrate our nuclear capability. It is very well established now. So choice will be with Pakistan whether there is any technical compulsion for Pakistan to go for nuclear testing in response to India's nuclear test by testing some of the new designs which have been developed after 1998 and have yet to be tested, especially the plutonium-based devices. That option would be open to Pakistan. But at the same time, if Pakistan wants to take the high moral ground, it may refrain from testing. The compulsion, like, as I said, 1998 is not there. As far as Zafar's question about NPT is concerned, CTBT is not going to affect NPT. It is a dead horse already. It has nothing to do, and NPT has its own problems. The RevComs we have seen since 2005, they have been one failure after the other. And this time it has already been postponed. One doesn't know when the RevCon would be held. Probably it will be in 2021 if the situation improves by that time. But one is not sure about that. But RevCon is just a debating club where the non-nuclear weapon states, members of the NPT, they give air to their grievances, and the P5 states, they try to pacify them. But the outcome is always, it is immaterial, because the decisions or debates or discussion in the NPT RevCom is not binding on any member state. So this is just a formality. It is not going to have any effect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other panelists would like to answer, or Ambassador Naqvi, if you want to make any remarks, please go ahead. Mansoor, you can say something.
On nuclear testing, I'll just add a few points. There are two purposes of testing. One is technical and the other is political. As Dr. Salik mentioned, I think there is more of a technical, there might be more of a technical justification for conducting tests in South Asia. Now, what happened in '98 was that out of 5 of India's nuclear tests, 3 of them fizzled out, one of which was a thermonuclear device. The first stage worked, the second stage did not work. The second thing is that if you look at reports by independent analysts of the data that was released of those tests in India and Pakistan at that time, and if you compare it with the number of tests that were conducted by the United States, for example, more than 1,000 tests and about 700 by the former Soviet Union, I think from a purely technical viewpoint, one way of obtaining data is hydrodynamic hydronuclear testing, which is also known as cold testing, subcritical tests. The other one is validating the design data through hot tests. The data that both countries got, I think, is insufficient for a triad that both countries are building right now. Because of the need to have miniaturized devices with hybrid cores for more efficient use of fissile material and more powerful devices that can be put on MIRVs. One way of doing that, as I said earlier, was hydrodynamic testing. But given the track record that the Americans and the Russians had, they had access to supercomputers. And despite that, they exercised the option of hot tests. The French continued to test until the mid of the 1990s in the South Pacific. And when they thought they had plenty of data, then they called off their tests. The other thing is political, and the repercussions for India. I mean, India might get a waiver from the United States. The sanctions that are automatically triggered by nuclear testing, sanctions coming from the United States, will come into effect for any country that conducts nuclear tests. The Indians might get another waiver. I'm not sure about Pakistan. And there will be an economic effect that will have to be taken into account. But in the final analysis, it's also a question of restoring deterrence. It's a question of restoring balance of power. You have to continue to communicate and signal and demonstrate your will and resolve and the capability itself for reassuring the adversary that your deterrent is credible. And for that, maybe if India conducts tests, Pakistan might have to follow suit and might not have another choice or any other option. And it will allow Pakistan to conduct tests of plutonium-based devices, boosted fission devices. Pakistan is not known to have developed a thermonuclear device or tested one at all. The Indians have, and particularly against China, they will need thermonuclear weapons. And now that you might have read a piece in the Global Times and this Chinese newspaper calling for increasing the size of China's arsenal, and the fact that they're also modernizing their existing nuclear capabilities, the Indians might have an additional justification to conduct the tests, which is why the US might give them a waiver. We really don't know, but it's a situation that can only be really predicted when the time comes, basically.
Can I add?
Yes, sir. Doctor, you can ask.
I think that both Dr. Salik and Dr. Mansoor has very rightly pointed out, you can say about the CTBT. CTBT is not, it has not entered into force. It is nothing there. No, I'm not going to repeat it, but here I want to draw the attention. If you see in 1974, India conducted tests for political consumption for a domestic audience. Same is in 1998. The threat at that time, India was not facing which required the nuclear testing, which required the deterrence, establishing deterrence or demonstrating the nuclear capability to check anybody else. Because if you see, in 1996, India and China signed the border CBMs on border, and after that, it has started working very correctly. So if you can recall these two experiences, first with the Congress, second with the BJP and its manifesto, and again, if you see in 2020, let's say if India get an option, definitely BJP will go for a testing because their manifesto says that they are going to modernize their nuclear capability. And for a modernization, they need a testing to demonstrate for political consumption internally, domestically. So my understanding is that if Americans start testing, India definitely will test. It gives them an opportunity to the Modi government that they will go to divert the attention, that where they are going. It establishes, you can say, slogan or his election saying Chaukidar slogan, and that would be, and it depends on Pakistan. And I agree with that, that if Pakistan live with this, of course, Mansoor is right technically, that for the triad, you have to modernize your weapons. And we don't have a testing, you can say, because when we, in May 1998, Pakistan conducted tests, it was claimed that they were uranium. And if we are going to use the lighter devices for our MIRVs or these kind of things, definitely Pakistan also need technical, for technological reasoning for testing. So my here conclusion on this point is CDBT, NPT has nothing to do with the strategic environment of South Asia. They are the treaties with, CDBT is a draft, NPT is a treaty without any sort of application here. They further lost their credibility the way the supporters of this treaty treated India in the NSG with the NSG waiver or MTCR, XYZ. So we should forget about these kind of these things. Now we can focus. In the case of India, my understanding is the testing will take place for political reasoning, and in case of Pakistan, the testing will take for technical reasoning. Thank you.
Sir, Ambassador Naqvi, would you like to add something, sir? Sir, yes. Would you like to add few comments on this? Sir, your mic is off.
Yeah. Is it on now?
Yeah, it is on. It is on.
Okay. My only thought that comes on this, and I think we have heard very learned responses, is the Indo-US nuclear deal. Because the Indo-US nuclear deal, I remember there was a lot of debate going on in Congress that India should be forced or subjected to a commitment not to test. And I think this provision was eventually not kept in the deal as it was approved under the Hyde Act in Congress. So if that be the case, if that is what happened, and if my recall is correct, then I think India does not have any constraints or restrictions on it in this regard. So this is what came to my mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have
just quick addition to this, the
sure,
point
sir,
which Ambassador Naqvi raised. The Hyde Act tried to bring in CTBT obligation to India, but even at bilateral level, but India did not agree. However, the understanding was that if India conducts another test, that will be the end of the US civil nuclear cooperation with India. So there would be consequences. The US administration may not want it, but there will be a lot of opposition in the Congress for continuation of that US-India civil nuclear cooperation in case India tests. So that is for sure. Second thing is that the Glenn Amendment of 1984, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Prevention Act, that requires the US government to impose automatic sanctions. It is not in the hand of the US administration to decide or not. The sanctions will be automatically triggered. However, in certain conditions, the US president can give some waivers, but the sanctions would be triggered. They cannot avoid that.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have few questions which are directly directed to the panelists. So I have a question for Dr. Ahmed. It is from Nida Shahid. Uh, she is asking that while talking about the need to strengthen economy, how do you see Pakistan and India coping with the state of economy which is likely to emerge following the COVID-19 pandemic? Do you foresee countries like ours still remaining focused on military developments, even though the economy of all countries are likely to plummet in the coming months? So your comments on the economic thing, Dr. Mansoor.
So, in terms of military spending, now there are two aspects to it. One is that, of course, foreign acquisitions, import of high-tech conventional equipment will suffer in both countries because of the financial crunch that will come in the wake of the recession. But strategic buildup is related to indigenous capabilities. That has nothing to do with foreign procurement, direct foreign procurement of weapon systems, such as high-tech, big-ticket items like aircraft or submarines or naval ships, etc. And that is going to not really be affected. I think conventional forces might be affected for the time being. In India's case, they are already trying to enforce Make in India as a strategy for conventional force modernization. They have the access to all the weapon technologies, and there is an automatic clause of transfer of technology in almost all major weapon purchases. I'm not sure about Pakistan. Uh, so once they have the technology, they will be able to bring in foreign experts and cut costs, make the same things in India. That might affect quality, but for the time being, that can be a stopgap solution till they recover and look at the size of their economy. They have a much bigger cushion to sustain their defense spending over a period of time. In the immediate term, there will be a setback, there's no doubt about it. But in the nuclear domain, I don't think there is going to be much of a change. Because much of that capability is indigenous in terms of fissile material production, in terms of building of delivery systems, etc. And the same, I think, is the case with Pakistan. So nuclear modernization will largely remain on track. Conventional modernization might be affected in the short to medium term, but it'll be back on track once the financial cushion is available to both countries. And then, of course, there is the question of transfer of technology. I mean, they have a much bigger market, and they have many more suppliers that are willing to give them high-tech equipment, especially after STA1 and all the other concessions that have been CONCASA and everything else that has been accorded to the Indians by the United States as part of the India-US strategic partnership. Thanks.
So there are a few questions which are like directed to all the panelists. I will take 2 to 3 questions which are in same nature. So the first question is that what strategy would the panelists recommend to the government of Pakistan to offset India's advantage in space technologies, artificial intelligence, and other these sophisticated force modernization plans? So, Dr. Jaspal, you may start with this for the imbalance in these kind of technologies. So, how you would recommend the Pakistani government to address?
I think that the government of Pakistan has to invest in the technological sector. Instead of relying on the foreign expertise, we develop our own expertise. And technologically speaking, I think Brigadier Salik will correct me. Pakistan, India has a technological advantage, though they have what we call it in the chip industry, they have a lot of advantage, but at the same time, that is a medium level technology. But in the military sector, technological, if you see missiles, if you see the other kind of things, Pakistan is doing well. So that's why that is one side. Artificial intelligence or autonomous weapons, like these kind of things are also in the debate. Naturally, Pakistan has to focus. In the case of artificial intelligence, generally Chinese thinks that it is a revolution in the military affairs. my understanding is it is an enabling technology. So within that context, when we are looking about the enabling technologies, of course, through the allied sport, with our own effort, we can establish our own, you can say, capacity in this context. Now, in this way, when we are looking about the technological evolution, we have to be not, you can say, alarmed, because generally in the media or in the other things, these things, oh, India has did this, India is going for that, but we should not alarm. We should be very careful. We are very much technologically, you can say, doing well. Here, let me give you an example why I'm saying that we should not be alarmed. We should be concerned. For example, Mansoor has just pointed out, India had a first test in 1974. It took them a decade to reach for the second, third, fourth, fifth test in 1998. Out of the 5 tests, against 3 were fizzled out. One of them they are already admitting. So in that context, we should not be impressed what they're, you can say in the Western media say shining India, their economy, about the people say about the economy. It's a big state. Its own economy is now, you can say, in a process of slow down. India's own investment in the military technology or in these things, that is a very much debate within India. And many people are saying that there was a false digits. So by this way, of course, we should improve our base. We should invest in our technological sector through the university educations, or higher education should be applied education rather than this what happening in our universities, that we are just publishing papers and saying in our scientific field like our physics, chemistry, biological sciences, what being a part of a university structure, we are very much happy, okay, I publish a paper. And then I start counting my citation. But there must be more focus how we can apply them. Maybe one paper, it should be an applied, and incentive should be given on that sector. Thank you.
Okay. Sir Salik, would you like to add some comments?
Okay, Uma. I think Dr. Jaspal has already made very good comments on this, but I would just like to mention that in space, Pakistan, in fact, was ahead of India. Pakistan was the first country to start a space program. Indian space program started a year later than Pakistan. However, in 1971, as a result of Vikram Sarabhai profile, India upgraded its space program and started investing in it, whereas we neglected our space program and put SPARCO under the cabinet division, where there was nobody taking care of it. There was no funding and there was nobody responsible for it. Now for the last about decade or so, a little more, in fact, a decade and a half, the SPARCO has been now taken as part of the strategic organizations, and it is under the Strategic Plans Division and NCA. Therefore, the funding and situation and its goals and objectives have been clarified, and they are doing a lot of work on the remote sensing satellites and the communication satellites. So they have to cover a very big gap which was created over decades of negligence, but they will come up, they will catch up. So we, as far as our requirements are concerned, we are not too badly off. We are not competing with India in terms of anti-sat capabilities or trying to catch up with China. I think we are okay as far as our own requirements are concerned. And with the continued interest and focus on space technology, we should be able to catch up. As far as the artificial intelligence is concerned, I think that is not a question of hardware, that is a question of software. So we need to use our young minds. We have some very brilliant programmers, and they are the ones who are going to design and develop the software for artificial intelligence, and that should not be beyond our resources. The only thing is that we have to set up priorities. We already know that the president's initiative on providing this education about artificial intelligence to youngsters at very subsidized rates, a lot of people have already registered and joined, and they are undergoing those courses. And in due course, we will have enough of manpower working on this side, so there's nothing to really worry about it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, all the panelists. We have few questions related to the NFU, which are few directed to the Dr. Mansoor, Sir Jaspal, and Dr. Salik. So I will take all three questions in a line, so you will answer accordingly. First question is from Ms. Ghazala Jalil from ISSI. She is asking that India is talking about abandoning NFU. Not only that, but there is a preemptive turn in its doctrinal thinking. What are options in the face of this challenge? And other question related to the NFU is that do you think that India's no first use policy is under strain currently? In the light of technology, India has the first strike capability and also has technologically sufficient counterforce capability. Secondly, due to technological imbalances, whether classical deterrence works here or not. So, Dr. Mansoor, you may start from the NFU questions. That do you think it is under stress, or over to you?
Well, there is a pattern to it, actually. The Indians have been working on their cruise missile program for the past 2 decades. And now that they have built a triad of BrahMos, they're still working on the Nirbhay. They're conducting R&D, 1,000 kilometer range Nirbhay. They're extending the range of BrahMos. They're integrating lightweight, new generation BrahMos missiles with the Sukhois under the SFC. So the counterforce strategy has been in the making for a very long time. And that is what gave them the confidence to start debating. The other thing is essentially the build-up of fissile material. I keep repeating this again and again. I've been talking about this for the last 10 years, and I've been vindicated over time. There is a reason why they have termed this their strategic stockpile, the huge amount of 11 to 15 tons of civil plutonium outside safeguards. That will provide them the option for a nuclear war fighting strategy, which is now embedded in their in the joint doctrine and the land warfare doctrine. You can go and read that. And they talk about conducting, carrying on conventional operations in the nuclear environment after a nuclear attack. So it's very clear that they are, and that will also serve them to deter China, because they don't have the sufficient conventional forces to deter or fight Chinese at the moment. So I think the India's counterforce strategy is essentially a product of their technological maturation and the triad that they've been building. And that is also manifested in the fact that right after Pakistan's Nasser test, they conducted the first test of the battlefield, short-range battlefield ballistic missile, Prahar, within a few months, which was in the which must have been under development for many years before. And the DRDO statement said that it can carry all types of warheads, which is a euphemism for a nuclear capable missile. We were more explicit for signaling purposes with the Nasser, which is why it probably got all the attention, all the negative spotlight. While India's counterforce build-up continue to be given the benefit of the doubt in Western circles, when people would say, they are still saying, no, India's cruise missiles are not nuclear tipped, even though the Indians themselves are saying that they are integrating them under the SFC. Some of the India's key leaders, such as General B.S. Nagal, for example, has talked of adding a nuclear component to the counterforce strike capabilities, and others have said so also. So this debate that has just come about is no coincidence. It was in the making, and they've just come out in the open now because they are confident that they are on the path of technological maturation and military modernization to the point at a point where they can use this strategy without probably actually officially changing their doctrine. It gives them the flexibility of conducting counterforce strikes. Another aspect is, if they carry out large-scale counterforce strikes with conventional warheads from BrahMos, they are also building a hypersonic version of the BrahMos. on Pakistani command and control and deployed strategic forces during a crisis, that will produce strategic consequences. That will be inherently escalatory. I think India's counterforce strategy is essentially a combination of their conventional counterforce and nuclear counterforce. And another point is that is missed in the debate is the canisterization of their ballistic missiles, which means that they can launch them at very short notice. And they're probably moving, part of their arsenal might be moving towards a launch on warning or launch under attack posture for first strike. And that will generate first strike instabilities, basically. And if you link this with the deployment of a BMD shield, regardless of how effective it is going to be, this will give them a false sense of security, because they will think that during a crisis, they can take out Pakistani first strike capabilities, whatever portion of it, and they can absorb the residual Pakistani retaliation and probably lose one or two cities, but they can protect their leadership and fight and win a nuclear war. And this is becoming all the more dangerous because of a completely irrational ruling elite that is now in New Delhi, which is oblivious to the dangers of escalation even during a conventional conflict with Pakistan. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Jaspal, would you like to add or make few comments?
I think that it has been very rightly pointed by both my fellows about the India's no first use. I just wanted to add 2 points. A, from the very beginning, if you critically examine their no first use sort of statements, against Pakistan, there was no first use. There was first use option starting from 2003 onward, whatever way you can elaborate it. The alarming thing is what Mansoor has pointed out about their counterforce. And in the last 2 decades, they developed it, they matured it. And that's the reason today they talk about surgical strike or these kind of the things. And the most important thing is in the literature, what we are reading about, they are thinking about splendid first strike capability. And if you couple the splendid first strike capability with their BMD systems, then it gives them the advantage that they can go for splendid first strike, and whatever is left, you can say check it or defend it by their BMD system. Theoretically, it seems workable. Technologically and practically, it doesn't seem workable. But if you see in the India, the leadership, and especially the political leadership, which is lacking the technological background, but very much driven by their ethos and ideology and you can say strong views, in such a situation, the element of rationality or the element of technological calculation misses. It will go to the abstract level where political leaders can go for taking. So by this way, we cannot take these statements emanating from the Indian side lightly. There could be a probability of military misadventure leading to escalation and destruction. So this no first use, when they were saying, at least we were saying that they're thinking about it not to use nuclear weapons. But now there is no first. They have a first use option. So they are thinking what Mansoor called it, nuclear war fighting capability. So we have to live with that.
Thank you, sir. So we are running out of time. So there are lots of questions on social media, like on Facebook, YouTube, and in our question and Q&A box. So, sir, there are a few questions directed to Dr. Jaspal related to the China-India crisis. So, would you like to elaborate that? Here, question is that military tensions between India and China in Ladakh, and there appears to be a conventional imbalance between these two countries, how it will impact the dynamics of escalation and deterrent strategies for South Asian region overall. And the other question is from Syed Muhammad Ali, it's on the Facebook. He asks you that China has called Indian bluff. Sir, you mentioned in your presentation. Sir, can you please elaborate on the context of the current state of Sino-India crisis? So what's your take on that between India and China?
Thank you. In this case, when we talk about, I just repeated, because during the during this Pulwama crisis, Prime Minister Modi was continuously saying we called off, you can say, Pakistan's nuclear bluff. And I said that when the Chinese troops moved inside and they have beaten the Indian troops, it means they were beating the nuclear armed states troops were beating the nuclear armed states troops, which is unprecedented in the nuclear history, as the air combat was unprecedented. But what was the tone? In the case of Pakistan, our tone was very clear and firm that we are going to retaliate, we are going to quid pro quo plus, and we did it. Is India going for quid pro quo plus kind of a strategy towards the China? Is India going to escalate? And what Mansoor has said, referred yesterday's speech, that we try to resolve it peacefully. This is point. My understanding is India is not going to escalate its crisis with China. Neither China is going to escalate its crisis with India. Both states act rationally, and they are going to, and these crises are not new. In the last 4 or 5 years, if you see these kind of the border tensions in which there's no casualties, there is no use of firearms. So that is the point. So they are reacting. For Chinese, they wanted to abstain or whatever they, for Indians, they have a political objective from this crisis, diplomatic objective. They wanted to sell to their Western allies that we have a resilience to fight with the China, because we say that India and China as a phony rivalry. And second, India's current economic slowdown policy requires that there should be a mega investment or foreign direct investment from the Western countries, because if you see Americans and Chinese, if the economic tension increases, they will start looking to the other markets. So India will be you can say, a market for surplus or an innovation. So it's a strategy of a border tension with China. By the India, it's a strategy to declare that they have a resilience, or they can check, they have a courage. Second, it's a strategy to divert the attention of the international community from what they are doing in the Indian occupied Kashmir towards this side, because international community lesser hear today human rights, they hear more. I mean, here by international community, I'm referring the West, American-led West, they hear more about, or they like to hear more about China something doing and how to respond that. So that is the ploy of the Indians, this crisis. So we should not be, you can say, here I am reading, oh, India and China military will be going to say, no, it will be not. Now, on the other side, it justifies Prime Minister Modi's investment in the military hardware, in the conventional purchases. And as we all know, that if the India, when built it militarily, towards the China, it is talking about peacefully resolving and openly saying it is going to capture Azad Kashmir, so for whom this military build-up is. So it will be diplomatically, politically, economically justifiable because they have a crisis, conflict with China, and militarily usable against Pakistan because they are saying, oh, Pakistan is doing this. So by this way, my understanding is that this China crisis will be used by the Indian media, by the Indian leaders in their advantage, and that will create a disadvantage for Pakistan. So that's why we should be prepared for it.
Okay, thank you, sir. So we will take one more question. In fact, two more questions quickly. Sir, this question is directed to Dr. Salik. It's from Dr. Adil Sultan. He stated that in case India tests, Pakistan will have the choice of not responding and maintaining a morally high position. Keeping in view the nature of relations and military asymmetries between the two countries, it seems a very unrealistic option. Why should Pakistan demonstrate and allow the asymmetry to grow further? Sir, this question is directed to you, Sir Salik. Please, would you like to respond to this?
I don't think so. There is anything unrealistic about my response to this, because what I said was essentially that Pakistan will have two choices this time. In 1998, Pakistan had no choice but to test, to restore the strategic balance, and also that was the opportunity for Pakistan to demonstrate its nuclear capability. Now that capability is demonstrated, it is very well established, it is operationally active, that compulsion is not there. So this time we'll have two choices. We can test and we may not test. We can test if we have a compulsion to, as Dr. Mansoor also pointed out, to test the veracity of our plutonium-based devices designs, or any other advanced designs that we might have developed which need testing. But at the same time, we can also refrain from testing and take the moral high ground. The point is that it's not only moral high ground, there is an economic factor also. As I mentioned, the moment you test, the Glenn Amendment related sanctions will be automatically triggered. And as was mentioned earlier by my co-panelists, that in case of India, the Americans may exercise the option of waiving off those sanctions. In Pakistan's case, that is not going to happen. So are we prepared to take that kind of economic hardship given our current fragile economic environment, and particularly after the COVID-19 negative effect on the economy? So we have to be rational. We just don't have to thump our chest and say that we are very brave and we don't bother about anybody, we can challenge anybody. We have to be realistic, see our own house, put our house in order. If we do not have that kind of capability to sustain that economic hardship, we should not unnecessarily be beating the drums. If it is not necessary, we may exercise. But I am not saying that totally ruler. The decision would be taken at that moment given the circumstances. But that option is available, and we have to be sensible about it. Not that we test another device and then we have the economic collapse. So that is what I was trying to point out.
Huma, I would like to quickly add what
Sure.
Dr. Salik has pointed out. My take here is that on the testing issue, it should not be determined by India's action. It should be determined by our own needs. The government of Pakistan make this clarity, and in the media or in the discourse, we start debating that if we need it, even if we are not a signatory of the CTBT, if our defense is required, we can go for testing, whether India go or not, whether the trend or not. And if we are confident and comfortable with the existing testing data, we should not. So we should not be driven by emotional reactions or by this kind of a discourse, oh, India did it, we did. We are a nuclear weapon state. Try to live as a nuclear weapon state. And a nuclear weapon state's requirement is it must be a confident state. It shouldn't be reacting. It shouldn't be having a knee-jerk reaction in its strategies, in its policies. So our nuclear strategy must be based on, you can say, with a well-thought, reflecting confidence, avoiding knee-jerk reactions, and we should be prepared, and we should develop this kind of understanding in our nuclear strategic community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. We have so many questions, but I will take last two questions. There is our senior fellow, Ms. Saima Sayal. She is asking that now India has moved to sea-based nuclear capabilities and towards change its posture towards preemptive counterforce, which has been discussed earlier as well. But the precision strike offensive capabilities going forward in the next 2 decades, what do the panelists think are the 3 biggest challenges for deterrence and crisis stability for South Asia, specifically in the naval domain? So,
Huma, quickly I can respond, and because
yes,
I have to leave because my understanding was 1:30 and I have another meeting. In the context of naval base or these kind of the things, I think that Pakistan should focus on not numerical matching. We should focus on the capability to deter. For example, if India go for aircraft carriers, we can use our 5/8 strips for our defense, and our naval posture should remain for deterring rather than for offensive, or you can say that kind of thing. And within that, instead of matching and you can say be under the burden of defense budgets, we should act rationally as we are maintaining our deterrence very efficiently with the $10 billion US. Maybe we can increase further, but not like India going 54 or 60 plus billion US. So there's a need that we should be avoiding balance of conventional thinking of balance of power, we should go for living with the nuclear terminology, balance of terror. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, if you have 1 minute, I have one last question. It's a general one. If you would like to respond, just do it.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Sure,
you
sure,
can
sure.
leave. So it's a
Sure.
question from Air Marshal Kaleem Sadat. It's that why isn't Pakistan leadership is thinking strategically in the context of slogan of corruption has brought the country to its knees, no development, no economic growth, debt mounting, adding $25 billion in 2 years. Revenge is a bad political strategy for any ruling party. So it's kind of a political question, but if anybody wish to respond to this comment, so
I think that Air Marshal Saab is well, you can say, far ahead than us with his experiences to answer this question by himself. But what is my quick response on it is, yes, this revenge is a bad political strategy. It always creates a political instability. It's not there. But on the other side, when you look with the 25 billion corruption, or you can say these kind of things, you have to maintain a balance. Unfortunately, Pakistan's political culture, let me repeat it, political culture is still full of subjective and parochial traits rather than participatory political culture. We need to evolve it systematically. Our political leadership has to evolve it. If you, I can just here give you, to qualify my point on the political culture, our all political parties, leading political parties, they have a dynastic political setting, or their power base is on the individual personalities rather than political party infrastructure. That qualifies my first point. Second is, yes, Pakistani leadership need to think strategically, including Pakistani academia and the think tank, or you can say thinkers. Why I'm saying, and that was a part of my previous response, addition to Brigadier Salik Saab's, when he was responding on this, that whether we test or not. So we start looking strategically things. We make it and we debate it. We should not be afraid of criticism. Our civil military bureaucracy take the criticism on the, or makers of the strategy take the criticism as a positive sort of thing and try to reform it. So listen to different thoughts, whether they are opposing, against, like on CTBT, like on testing, me and Salik maybe are prepared, not now, maybe tomorrow, maybe Adil thinking now, maybe Mansoor thinking even before the India, so we can debate it. So debate, culture of debate is required to mature our strategic outlook. Thank you very much.
okay, thank you, sir. So
Uma, can I respond quickly to
yes, sir,
this?
sure, please, yes, sir, please go ahead.
Although this is a political question and we are not commenting on politics, we're talking on strategy and security issues. However, my quick comment on this is that what we hear is that the civilian and military leadership is on the same page, which means that all these policies which are being followed by the government are with the consent of both the civilian and military leadership. So if the civilian government is unable to think strategically, I think then it's up to the military leadership to give some strategic advice to them. And I am sure the Air Marshal in his days as the head of the PF would not have tolerated any kind of corruption or misappropriation or any indiscipline in his command. So how does he expect the government to ignore corruption? Every government has its priorities. Some government has the anti-corruption priorities. Some government had building of motorways as its priority. Everybody has its priority. But then I hope he's not suggesting that we close our eyes to the corruption in our country and just move on. I hope not. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Since I have received lots of questions, but due to the time limitation, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our webinar. I thank you all for your active participation, for taking time out on watching it on Facebook and YouTube, and by registering to our webinar. I would like to apologize on behalf of Ambassador Ali Sarwar Naqvi. He's facing some internet problems, so he might not be able to join to conclude the session. So here I will say that I hope you all enjoyed the discussion, learned a lot from the experienced practitioners, experts, and academicians. We thank you all again to join us for this webinar. Goodbye and Allah Hafiz.